Okay, we should probably make a start. We're here to celebrate this beautiful, interesting looking book, Arcadia, by Iain Pears. But I'm not going to be chairing or introducing the book or the panel to you today. That's going to be Alex Butterworth's role. I'm just here as director of TORCH. My name is Alex Butterworth, and I'm just here to welcome you all to TORCH and to invite you to look at all our events and programs and networks. As you all know, I think TORCH is here to encourage, welcome, support, facilitate, stimulate interdisciplinary work in the humanities. We have a number of different programs, including medical humanities, I think, involving quite a few people here, and also digital humanities that we would love to invite you to take another look at and to be involved in. So I'm just going to say a few words about Alex. It's great that Alex is chairing here today. Alex has been involved with digital forms of narrative for 2 decades as a researcher and a practitioner. From 2002, he has explored the construction of narrative accounts of networks in 2 published analog works of narrative history, Pompeii, The Living City, and The World That Never Was, a true story of dreamers, schemers, anarchists, and secret agents, both books had their origins in as yet unrealized digital projects. So I can't think of a better person to chair the session than Alex Butterworth, given that he straddles the digital and the analog in that way. So Alex, I'm going to ask you to come and introduce the panel, please. Thank you very much.
Hello, thanks for coming. I was reflecting recently on my own first encounter with digital forms of narratives, with hypertext, almost 25 years ago when I was on undergraduate here. And I would be going up to Coventry to one of the very early courses in interactive systems, where a German friend was creating a hypertext novel called Schwam. It was around the time that Robert Coover was reporting back from the Brown University Hypertext Fiction Workshop in his article The End of Books, talking about the fluidity, contingency, indeterminacy, plurality, discontinuity that were the buzzwords of hypertext in that day. It's therefore kind of exciting and also rather moving for me to be speaking and presenting and sharing this panel today for the Humanities and Digital Age programme, which is, for the first time I think in the programme, placing the practice of digital creativity in the humanities in the context of academic study. It's an area that demands and opens up new kinds of interdisciplinarity and will suggest new creative and critical methods in retrospective humanities investigations too. I'm very delighted to introduce a panel that hints at the range of expertise that's now being brought to bear on the interactive medium. And to begin with, Iain himself, who we're here to celebrate for the publication last year of his book, Arcadia, a physical kind of material souvenir of the core project, which is an interactive novel presented on iPad, which he will, I'm sure, explain and talk about more. It's here represented in its surface interface. I first encountered Iain's work with The Dream of Scipio in 2002, I think. And I can't think of anyone better to be sort of signalling the transition of mainstream authors into the realm of interactive fiction. His work is so clearly, naturally seated in that area, from the fragmentary cultural history of Dream of Scipio, which spans 3 centuries, a millennia and a half apart, to the instance of The Finger Post, with its multifaceted account of a murder told through 4 consecutive unreliable voices, and more recently Stone's Fall, which offers a narrative that reverses into its central character's history in 3 large steps. All are exercises in formal experimentation of a kind to twist the minds of most novelists into a state of collapse. But there's a boldness to his writing, which is manifest in his use of narrators who are not only unreliable, but often sort of quite dislikable, and even opening novels, as in this case, with a sort of quite a relatively flat pastiche, which we discover, for the reasons for which we discover as the book goes on. He has that kind of bold confidence to in the writing to persuade the reader through the many other pleasures it offers of the need to persist. Arcadia itself is spread across 3 time periods again, 3 periods, locations, and modes. A 23rd century technological dystopia, a fantastical feudal Arcadia called Anterworld, whose temporal status is uncertain, and a 1960s Oxford of spies and inklings. But whilst written as a hypertext, the novel that lies behind it is of a structural and intellectual sophistication that cleverly supersedes or subverts, or perhaps both, the usual frustrations of that form. It folds the multiple narratives through the device of a mechanism of time travelling, or is it rather narrative modelling and configuration that's being mechanized, whose operation is uncertain even to its inventor. Indeed, this mechanism and the others listed within it become the subject of an experimental inquiry that is itself pivotal for the seemingly wildly divergent stories that the novel recounts. The digital manifestation of Arcadia both enables and constrains the cross-reading of the text with an elegant interface that maps character onto a simplified spatial temporal matrix. Locations, characters, events as dots, or moments of narrative as dots on the intersecting lines, which we'll talk about, I'm sure, later. My own experience was of starting with the app, and initially I found it frustrating and abandoned and went back to the analog book. And then after 40, 50, 60 pages, I returned to the app and discovered through the kind of the prompting, the initial construction of the narrative in the analog form, new strategies that made it constellate in fascinating ways. And I think actually exposed, particularly for me, the subtlety of its pacing and the humour. It's a very interesting moment for Iain to have published this work. I think the next 5 to 10 years are going to see some wonderful innovations in interactive fiction, which will kind of realise many of the ambitions that I've long cherished. And it's something that allows some extraordinary possibilities for authors too, for different kinds of collaboration, but also frustrations in that collaboration which need to be worked through. However, I think we're approaching a point where there are starting to be authors who are also coders, developers, who can express themselves, express narrative through in algorithmical form. I think one such author is Emily Short. I remember when Emily first appeared on the interactive narrative scene in 2000 with her stellar appearance with her prize-winning fiction Galatea, which brought a clear-sighted focus to the use of natural language processing to create an exquisitely realised, intimate dialogical interaction in a single confined space, at a time when much of the other work in there was much more dispersed. She's been hugely productive since, developing work that shows an extraordinary range, revealing endlessly new narrative possibilities, always organic to the developing media and in commands of the means available. The politically engaged rendition, for example, where the player's interrogation of a terrorist suspect leads them into an uneasy complicity in political violence. First draft of a revolution, an epistory novel, an interactive epistory novel, and not the first time for Emily, it's taking place in an alternative historical world. And her work on Failbetter's Hidden London playable story world, where narrative economies are fused with the looming economies of resource management. Over 15 years, she's established herself as a seminal figure in the interactive fiction field, as a practitioner and theorist, critic, and as anyone who wants to take the medium forward must be, a designer of tools for authoring. Most recently, Versal, which aims to model the nuances of social interaction. I hope this may be an area covered later in our discussion. Richard Beard was shortlisted last year for Goldsmith's Prize for Fiction, that opens up new possibilities for the novel form. The book recognised was The Acts of the Assassins, an account of the early years of Christianity told as a hard-boiled detective story. It employs a technique that Richard has described as quantum fiction, in which his characters exist simultaneously in the historical past and present, producing effects that are both mesmerising and disquieting. It's an approach that looks back to an earlier novel, Damascus, in which lifespans of narrative are played out on a single day, 1st of November 1993. Influenced by the Ulupo movement, which perhaps you will talk about, Richard's work embraces constraints. Damascus was written using only words found in the Times newspaper on that day. His novel X20 counts down the cravings of a smoker trying to kick the habit with recollections of past moments of inhalation. The Cartoonist is a novel that's set in Euro Disney that exists in 2 versions, one expurgated to meet the requirements of copyright and libel law, the other forever to be unread. In 2013, Richard adapted his short story, James Joyce's English language teacher Papercut's experiment in designing a generic storytelling app, Papercut. Richard reflected after that experience that now I have a working idea of how effective Papercut technology can be, I see no reason why the next step shouldn't be a first interactive iPad novel, written exclusively as a new form for a new format. Perhaps Arcadia will inspire him to write the second iPad novel by an analog author. Sophie, unusually for these events, is the only academic on the panel, a lecturer in English in the English faculty. She's recently written, a little while ago, she wrote On Sympathy, which broached questions about fictional belief, identifications, and the dynamics between readers, writers, and fictional characters. It explores how analogical modes of thought and allegorical modes of storytelling can provide a means to transcend the limitations of our capacity to understand characters sympathetically in ways which I think may be pertinent to Ian's writing in Arcadia. She's also written a paper recently, the episodic Trollop, which I don't think is yet published, is it?
No, but I think it would be next month. So.
Okay. In which she reflects on the rhythms of publication, Trollop's 24 serial units, and on episodic lives, quoting Gail Strawson's work on self and narrativity. The idea of episodic selfhood, the idea that one can live, questioning whether one can live a morally good life without the notion of a continuous self. Again, something that is relevant to the fragmented lives scattered across Ian's book. She's also recently received funding from the university's IT Innovation Fund for an app building a writing space and opening doors, which uses spatial mnemonics to explore how to educate writers in argumentational and narrative structure. So I'd first like to ask Emily to speak about her experience of Ian's book. I'll then ask Richard and Sophie, and finally Ian will respond.
I have to just make one small correction.
Sure.
Sorry, rendition is not mine. I've written about it, but it's by somebody else. So I don't want to claim responsibility for somebody else's work. The Arcadia App, which fortunately we have a picture of up here, is one of the most substantial and interesting works of interactive fiction released last year. And when I speak about interactive fiction, I'm referring to a wide range of work, including literary hypertexts in the tradition of Shelley Jackson's Patchwork Girl from 1995, or interactive genre fiction, such as Roger Chandrasekera's post-colonial fantasy The Snape Game, the surreal twine poetry of Porpentine, or interactive horror by Michael Lutz, interactive comics such as the work of Jason Shiga or Troy Chin, interactive film shorts and documentaries, enhanced ebooks, and old-fashioned game books like the Fighting Fantasy series, and even video games with a strong narrative element, such as Ingle Studios' 80 Days, which is another take on Around the World in 80 Days, or Fail Better Games' Sunless Sea. The unifying aspect of this very diverse field is that all of these pieces make some artistic use of the reader's choices. Sometimes these choices are about what the protagonist should do next, sometimes they are purely about matters of presentation and motive, what the field tends to refer to as reflective choice. And sometimes, as with Arcadia, there are choices about reading order. In what sequence is the reader going to encounter the particular reading units that are available? Each of those dots on the screen corresponds to a short chapter of text that you could read from some character's point of view. How is the reader going to explore the space that is the text? And is their exploration going to be, or is it even able to be, a complete exploration? So though these come from different traditions, use graphics differently, and rely on different funding models, many of the authors of these works are at least somewhat aware of one another and have developed conventions for talking about their presentational choices. And I'd like to bring some of that background to bear on Arcadia, both in terms of how Arcadia fits into the tradition of interactive fiction and how modes of reading interactive fiction can help us understand this particular work. But I feel I should frame this by apologizing first, because the author has said that he wanted the app of Arcadia to be as transparent as possible, feel like reading a book, and avoid many of the explicit interface features that emphasize the interactivity of other interactive fiction. So perversely, and I'm sorry, I'm going to focus on that exact aspect that he said he'd hoped readers would be able to ignore. So, interactive fiction has a long history of offering an intentional challenge for the reader. New media scholar Nick Montfort proposes to interpret such fiction by analogy with a literary riddle as an art form in which the struggle to comprehend what it means is inherent in the reading project. And Arcadia very much fits into this tradition of telling a story that is a puzzle. Because it's a story of time travel and possibly a story of travel between levels of reality, it requires that the reader put serious work into reconstructing cause and effect and coming up with their own concept of what has actually happened here. A cause may occur in our reading well after the effect, and even in some characters' own version of chronology, the cause and effect may be reversed. More than that, the app version of Arcadia relies on a certain type of literacy on the part of its reader or viewer, an ability to pull together disparate threads, to go looking for specific information, and even a willingness to decide consciously on a reading strategy. Now, picking a reading strategy is not a decision that most of us are used to consciously making when reading fiction under ordinary circumstances. The strategy usually boils down to read the page, get to the end of the page, turn the page. But frequently we do need a strategy to approach hypertexts or other forms of literary interactive fiction, which links we will pursue first and which later. Do we want to seek out every little detail of one story node before moving on to the next, if the work is even organized to allow that? Or do we want to read through once quickly to get a sense of narrative arc and then come back again later, creating alternative secondary readings to buttress the first? Do we intend to find every possible outcome of the story, or just read until we find the one that we like best and stop? Do we want to just read until we feel like we understand and decide that we're done then? And then sometimes, and this is where the real sort of power struggle arises between the reader and the author, even when we have made a decision about how to read an interactive work, we may find that the work's form blocks us or seduces us with alternative distractions. So Jason Shiga's interactive comic about multiple universes, meanwhile, allows the player to choose which panels of art to follow through the interactive comic, but partway through the book there's a giant full-page picture of a squid, unrelated to any of the storyline paths, and it would be a really steely or unimaginative reader who managed to flip past this image without at least stopping to wonder what it was about, and how they could possibly end up in that timeline. That said, a lot of interactive fiction does provide more guidance about how to read than the app of Arcadia. With this work, we can select and read any piece in any order we like. So we can pick any of the dots on that map and go there and start reading there. Much hypertext, by contrast, confines the reader to moving forward only via a handful of links from the current node, and a lot of other interactive fiction uses some concept of locks or guard fields to prevent the player from reaching certain information prematurely. So Arcadia, unusually even in the field of interactive fiction, requires that the reader of the app take responsibility for curating their own experience in a way that is quite uncommon with books and unusual even, as I say, in interactive narratives. Placed next to the book, Arcadia, the app, provides some information that the book lacks, but it also lacks some information that the book offers, and here's what I mean by this. The app tells us who is involved in each snippet of story, where it takes place, and for at least one form of chronology, when it happens relative to the other events. And because we do have that access as readers, as with Jason Shiga's Squid, we have the agency. We can look at this map and it draws us into going and seeking out more pieces, more answers to what is happening in this mystery, more explanations of what's going on. The map itself is an invitation to discard a reading strategy that might be overly simplistic in favor of developing new ones and constantly seeking out new questions and new answers from this story. But because the app also contains material from the viewpoints of less central characters, And there's nothing to tell us which of the characters might be considered central and which not. It also allows for the possibility of a perhaps less happy sort of initial contact with the story, and this kind of gets back to what you were saying, I think. So for instance, when first reading Arcadia through the app, I tried reading Alex Chang's storyline for the first few sections, but this is a character who's very confused and is disoriented and doesn't understand what's happening to him at the beginning, and therefore he makes a challenging introduction to the story. The book omits his view of initial events entirely. The app makes it available to us if we want it, but does nothing to communicate that he's a secondary character whose authority is not likely to be helpful in the first reading. So Arcadia, the app, thus leaves open the possibility that luck may grant the reader a better or worse initial experience of the story, and they'll need to be persistent and thoughtful in ferreting out a meaning. And I think these formal traits are far from accidental. Arcadia is a story partially about someone who shares a lot of the world-building motives that underlie conventional interactive fiction. And I apologize because I'm going to read your text. Lytton sniffed. "No goblins," he said. "This is serious. I want to construct a society that works, with beliefs, laws, superstitions, customs, with an economy and politics, an entire sociology of the fantastic." And his friend says, "A story as well, I hope." Naturally, but stories take place in societies, otherwise they cannot exist. The first must precede the second. This inclination, this pull towards world building, and the idea that the story cannot occur without rules to shape its possibility space is a concept very much in the spirit of interactive fiction and of stories told through games, especially digital games, which enable the author to create systems for the player to explore. Sometimes that might take the form of a map to traverse, sometimes an economy of trade that dictates profit and loss, sometimes a set of rules about interpersonal relationships that controls which characters might become friends and under what circumstances. A simulation game, such as Crusader Kings, generates a story of a dynasty of successive rulers, but a dynasty deeply influenced by military and financial resources, the personalities within your court, and even the decisions that you make about which laws of succession apply to your kingdoms. You can even decide whether your daughters can inherit or not. The lesbian schoolgirl mystery game, Black Closet, can develop to dozens of different endings, successful or unsuccessful, depending on the relationships between the girls and which information is uncovered in what order. Paolo Pedercini's The McDonald's Game is a simulation of running a fast food corporation in which, according to the rules, it is almost impossible to run the company profitably without damaging the environment and mistreating your low-paid employees. Now, he doesn't say that McDonald's does do those things intentionally, but instead he sets up a system in which the player will naturally gravitate towards those activities as the best way to win. So in these cases, the authorship lies less in the selection of plot events, but more in the selection of rules, the design of a kind of universe or kind of world in which certain types of stories can occur. The games theorist Iain Pears refers to this as procedural rhetoric, the way in which arguments are made and stories are told through the artful deployment of a system. Now, I don't want to suggest that Arcadia is procedurally driven in that way, but I think it is fair also to see procedural rhetoric in the structure of the Arcadia app. A great deal of the meat of this novel concerns how we deploy stories and how we understand events. Different characters seem to inhabit different genres, from science fiction to spy thriller to romance. The characters of Wilden rely on their collection of stories to interpret what happens to them and even use that collection as the basis of jurisprudence. So events themselves have no inherent atomic meaning. They're less important than the patterns into which we can fit them. And learning to read or select a meaning for what happens to us is part of the activity of understanding our life and bringing art to bear on our own lived experiences. Structurally, the Arcadia app itself gives us access to that experience by requiring us to choose the order in which we encounter the events and to choose our own interpretation of how those events relate to one another. It asks that we invent our own reading strategy and provides only a limited set of guides to help us choose. Its looseness of form, compared with a novel or even with a lot of other interactive fiction, becomes part of Arcadia's rhetoric.
Thanks everyone for coming, and for TORCH for inviting me to speak. I'm going to approach this slightly differently as a reader and as a writer. But as a reader, I decided to read the book first. And I think this is a reader's book. And one way you can tell that is by looking at how thick it is. I mean, readers pick up thick books because they like reading, they want to stay in a good book for as long as possible. So straight away you can see that it's a book for readers. It requires a certain amount of literacy. It then rewards that literacy because it's full of standard storytelling techniques. The story itself is ingenious, it's funny. In particular, it makes good use of manipulative narrative techniques with short sections that have cliffhangers at the end, and it defers the reader's gratification. These are conventional narrative techniques which are managed beautifully in this book. And what it does when you read it as a book is it reminds you that reading is great. Okay, you read a book like this, you think, this is what I like about reading, I'm immersed in this text, I trust the storyteller to guide me through these multiple characters, these multiple storylines, which in our mind we might map like that, but in terms of actual reading experience, we just go through in a chronological way, page by page. And then as a writer, I think, well, if reading is so great, and if these techniques are so powerful, these conventional techniques, why would I want to give up some of that power as a writer? Because when you manipulate a reader, it's because you can show a reader where to go next. When you defer a climax, for example, a mini climax within the story, you can choose when to bring the reader back again. On the app, you can't do that anymore because you don't know where the reader's going next. You cede that control. So as a writer, I read this book and then I look at that and I say, well, why would a writer cede that control over the reader? I don't know what you might be feeling. I don't know what effects my text, I don't know what effects I might be having. And that's really why I wrote the book in the first place, to have an effect on the reader. So in that sense, I would need to ask myself, well, what is better about the app? What in terms of the experience of narrative is improved in an app form, which I can't get in a book form? And it seems to me what often happens, and as I mentioned, the paper cut initiative, which was when a games programmer, a games company, took 3 stories and experimented with them to see how they could create an app which would enhance the stories which had originally been written in a straightforward, conventional form. And the first thing we learned from that is you have to change your text. You can't just go with your conventional story and say, this will be made into an app, it will somehow be enhanced. So the text needs to be changed, but then in terms of enhancement, these particular app developers brought in what would be recognizable techniques from other art forms. So they added a soundtrack. There was an animation going on in the background of the screen as the words came up on the page. There was a voiceover. So in fact, you had lots of different art forms merging, and it was called enhancement. But what it wasn't anymore was reading. What it most resembled was a low-budget film with a voiceover. That's actually what it looks like. It was very cleverly done, and it works fantastic on the iPad. It looks great, but that's actually the art form that it resembles. So there was no obvious benefit by simply adding in anything you can think of which goes with screens and stories, which is what happened in that particular experiment with the paper cut. If you don't add in all those different things, then what you do end up with is however you navigate this map, you come up with the words on the screen. And it's recognizable, it's a recognizable screen from a Kindle, for example. It is black words on white text. It's a recognizable reading experience on this particular app, as you can see there on the page. Now, it's like, the question which this then raises for me is, when people are reading on Kindles, how has that affected the way that people read, that people write? And when you look at the sales figures for Kindles, it's overwhelmingly genre fiction which prospers on Kindle. So it's detective fiction, in particular procedurals, horror. In other words, stories which have very conventional narrative techniques in them. They're page turners. You've got your percentage to get through on Kindle. You can't actually see those pages. You're going through your percentage. It works when you look at the next page, the next page, the next page. So in fact, the screen reading of text has encouraged very conventional storytelling. That's what works on the Kindle. If you have formally adventurous texts, they don't work so well on the Kindle. You can't see patterns in structure as easily on a percentage reading as you can on a page in the hand. You might have design features in a print book which won't come out on the Kindle. In which case, if the app then appeals to conventional ideas of what it means to be literate, to follow a story, I think that it becomes slightly problematic in terms of, and it's something which I'd like kind of Iain to address when he speaks, is that if you're coming back to a book the whole time, you think, well, I could read this, or I could read this in a very similar way in a book, with the added advantage of the authorial control, which actually is part of the pleasure of reading, then why should this exist in this form? Why should people really be trying to develop apps in this way? And I think this connects slightly with the economics as well. It's one of, if anyone's had a chance to look at the apps, knows that you get a certain amount of material, and then if you want more material, you pay money, you pay more money. I think it's $2.99, isn't it? You pay $2.99 to access more of the story. I'd be interested to know whether there are any other models of trying to sell narrative in this way. You will get more if you pay more. Now, there are the serial novels of the 19th century, but I would say again, this works with conventional narrative. That worked because you wanted to know what happened next. And I think the breakthrough with these apps, with interactive fiction, is going to come when genuinely innovative narrative techniques are merged with the new technology. So the technology will be dependent on the new narrative techniques. The narrative techniques will flourish with the new technology. While they're still conventional stories, however brilliant they are, presented in app form, they will always be slightly disappointing to the reader, because there will always be the question of, why couldn't I just read this in a book? And I think that is the challenge for interactive fiction. It's to be as new as the technology demands. I'll be very interested to hear what Iain has to say about that later on.
Thank you. Delighted to be here for what strikes me as a very good combination of lunch and conversation, but I have been wondering where are the themed refreshments, because in Arcadia, one of the key players broaches any complex thinking, and we're doing complex thinking with the aid of period-specific enhancements, mood enhancements, and so depending on the age she lands in, this is Angela Mearson, the psycho-mathematician, pops half a tab, swigs white wine, offers round sherry in the 60s. And the sherry, actually I think she has gin, happens just down the road from where we are now. So I'm sort of imagining them in a counterfactual way, sitting down at the Randolph piano bar, listening to as time goes by. But I think we should have the sherry, partly a celebration because I hugely enjoyed reading Arcadia, but also for medicinal purposes, in case of literary trauma, because I felt this book has a huge strain of darkness running through it. It left me feeling, and it still leaves me feeling very unsettled, all things I couldn't deal with and I couldn't work out, and about self and other. But the thing I wanted to focus on talking about today is the relationship between the self and time, because that's something I've been thinking about a lot recently. And I want to use two characters in the novel to sort of space out two ways of thinking about living in time, Rosalind and Angela, Rosie and Angela. And one way of thinking about time, or the way we live in time, is the idea of living in time as a narrative, consequential, and wedded in some ways to a particular sort of future-driven morality. And the other way of living in time, if it's possible, resists narrative selfhood. It's ludic, it's spatially extensive, it's distracted, and it inhabits a different kind of ethics. And this is the kind of ethics that Alex mentioned Galen Strawson talks about, the sort of episodic ethics. Rosie is a character who enchanted me and I admired hugely, and she seemed closer to the first way of living to me. Like her Shakespearean double, Rosalind, she lives between worlds. Firstly, in its emotional sense, because she is a cat nurturer, a visitor of neighbours, a good Samaritan, and also in the literal sense, because she's the first character to go between worlds. She walks through the pergola in the cellar to Anterworld, which is and in many ways she seemed for me to stand for the exemplary reader-liver in the way that George Eliot might recognise. She stands for the expansion of our sympathies through an encounter with other worlds. But though she feels for other worlds, she still seems to possess a strong sense of narrative selfhood in one world. She has a through line. She continues to care about her primary universe and her commitment to it. She feeds the cat, she's got to feed the cat. She has a real sense of past and future consequence. And reading it, the other character who I was hugely drawn to is Angela, and this sense of narrative selfhood seemed far less strongly felt by her. Her dark egotism touched me. And initially she seems herself as absent from narrative continuity as you can imagine. She is a pleasure seeker and a pattern noticer. And she's an imaginer of alternative possibilities. And despite she has flashes of recognition when she remembers she has a daughter, and she has a desire that the whole of humanity should not be wiped out. She hears the news that she has blacked out most of Europe and killed nearly 10,000 people with almost perfect poise. I will fix it in due course. But at the beginning of the novel, she really seems to be almost severed from being in a time. And so, as I said, you could sort of think about these two characters as sort of somewhere on a spectrum of this paradigm of narrative and episodic. So, why am I slapping this rather crass paradigm onto this succulent, delicate book? I wanted to do it because I wanted to think about what happens to selves when we read in time, and I think that's something that's been continuous throughout our discussion. And the book, from its first words, imagine a landscape, invites us to think about our acts of reading. Reading Arcadia, in the app version or in the book codex version, the Rosie and me wanted to read for the plot. Wanted to work out how characters in 1960 might do something that would prevent future dystopias from happening, or how that was going to happen. But something that I think was done in the book, the way it was written, was it was unpicking that way of reading. The vignettes both court and resist these acts of readerly detection. And the app, too, it encourages us to move forwards, but also to swipe sideways, and to think about, and also to clear our reading history if we want to give up and start on another character further along. I was looking at some of the interviews you gave about the book, and you were quoted as discussing in your own reading practices in relation to your teenage children. And one thing that struck me is that you talked about the habit of reading continuously as something that you've grown up with and I grew up with. Whereas you said, and I don't know whether you were quoted accurately, but they absorb fragments and chunks of information and stitch it all together. And then there was, and you used the word, you said they're seen as moral failures, but it's not a moral thing. And I'm interested in the ideas of modes of reading as moral things or not moral things. I want to know what reading in fragments and chunks of information might mean for the sorts of ethical beings we're becoming. Are we reading well, or are we reading differently? Does the increasing ability to hold multiple worlds at once suggest a different conception of an ethical self? One which is not necessarily conscious of moving forwards, but is networked in many presents? And are there kinds of virtues in this? Does it suggest a kind of humility, a consciousness of worlds that there always could be a world in which things could be otherwise? Or is this constant side-swiping, this moving into arcades of Arcadia, is that something that we need to guard against? Is that what the novel might be saying to us? Is this constant swiping and arcades of Arcadia, will it actually make our actions ultimately weightless, like so many kisses and sighs in the digital wind? Stop there.
Thank you. Well, what a lot to respond to. I should start by saying that I am here as something of an imposter, really, because this word interactive, which has been bandied around, I was very, very keen when the project was being developed and when they were talking about, when the publishers were talking about it, I wanted the word interactive banned from every mention of the book, because the idea of interactive fiction does conjure up certain ideas in people's minds, and I was very much concerned that they would see the book, see the app, and be disappointed, because most of what interactive fiction is, mine isn't. It really doesn't do much except present the book in a different way, and was never meant to. The project to start off with, or as it developed, was very much more adventurous than it ended up being. But that got not a lot of what was really novel about it, got sort of stripped out in the development process. So what you get here is a sort of rump. All sort of writing is a negotiation, if you like. You have to try, if you're writing a book, you have to try and satisfy yourself, and you have to try and satisfy people who are going to be reading it. And there's no point doing one or the other. And the sort of knack of writing a book which is decent is to sort of satisfy both sides. And this is what I was going to do here. The thing about my previous books is that although they have worked moderately well, they were never as good as I wanted them to be. As a finger post did require readers to do far too much work, in that they had to remember, sort of on page 600, something happened on page 300, page 30. Scipio, which hopped from century to century every 2 or 3 pages, also gave some people headaches because they found that difficult to move from one to the other quite so quickly. And although I thought it was a good solution to what I was trying to do, I could sort of see that point. The main starting point for the Arcadia app was simply to allow both sets of people to read the book in the way that suited them. And it was no more than that, really. I wanted a book which was very much more complex than anything I'd written before, and avoid the possibility of it descending into total chaos, which would have been very easy to do. The book, as published, is about 60 or 70,000 words less than the app, shorter than the app. And it is simply because that 70,000 words represents the difference between comprehensibility and complete lunacy. So it had to come out in order to make the sensible. In the app you get much more, and underneath it you also get the notebooks on which the whole of the thing is based. If anybody ever notices them, one of the failings, I think, of the design of the app is that some of the fundamental text are actually rather difficult to find. But the part of the experiment with, if I am sort of trying to do a deal with the reader, you're also trying to do a deal really with the people who produce the book. So there's this complex dance that you have to do between author, reader, and publisher. So Arcadia was set up above all to be an experiment to try and come up with something which was aimed at a general reader who likes reading books, which could tell the story in the way that I wanted to tell it, and above all, which could be done. And this was where the more interesting parts of the project came in, because actually that is a very difficult thing to organize. Writing the book was relatively simple, but then changing it to be in such a way that it would not frighten readers even more than my books normally do was the difficult thing. Because the problem with the sort of more adventurous forms of interactive fiction is that they have relatively small constituency. They don't go out into they tend to attract people who are already interested in them rather than bringing new people in. And what I wanted to do was present this thing to people who had never read anything like this before and make them think that, okay, maybe this is worthwhile. And for that, I decided what I needed was something which resembled a book as much as possible, that it would do everything I wanted to do, present the choices, present the different ways of seeing, and so on, without being so outlandishly novel that it would cause difficulties. After that, then you end up trying to figure out how to produce it, because one of the great nuisances about software is that it costs money, and often costs rather more. I mean, it's a much more expensive way of doing things than just producing a book. And it struck me early on that these are even digital type books are never going to get anywhere if every time you produce one you need to spend a large amount of money on a bespoke piece of software, because the economics of these things just don't work. Whereas the hardback of this thing, I think, cost £15.99, and people will pay it and never, or not pay it, but don't actually grumble about it. The e-book costs, I think, $7.99. Again, people pay or not pay. The app costs $2.99, and people grumble like hell, even though it costs a lot more to produce. People have got used to the idea of not paying any money for these things, or paying 99p for these things. And there is no way at the moment that the finances add up in any way whatsoever. This was a surprise to me, and it was also a bit of a shock to the publisher, I think, when they realised it, because when the project was begun, the app market was just developing. Nobody knew whether it was possible to make money or how you would do it. And at the end, they came up with this thing where, a bit like e-books, they would like have a giveaway section. But then, so you could download the app and read a bit, but then you would have to pay if you wanted to continue, the freemium model. Because they knew they couldn't get people to pay even £2.99 if they couldn't have a look at it first of all, quite reasonably. Because on the other hand, they didn't give it away. So they had to come up with this in-app purchase model, which was the only way they could think of getting people to have a look at it. What went in this whole thing was my little attempt to be socially useful. Let's say that the original scheme was that the writing program that I had to write the thing, and then the app itself was meant to be reusable. It was meant to be a bit like Space Shuttle, but ideally you'd be able to get hold of the writing tool, write the thing, cant it into the app, and then launch another app yourself, so people would be able to produce things like this very, very cheaply if anybody wanted to. That went in the last stages of the production when a new software company took over, because it was no longer in the budget. Because getting a thing which would self-generate a matrix like that required sort of fancy maths that they were not really capable of doing. And then the next stage was that it was designed ideally to merge the author's role of writing a story with the world of fan fiction, where people would settle down and write new Sherlock Holmes stories and add on bits of Tolkien and all the rest of it. The idea there was that people could start writing their own fragments and add those on, so that it would be infinitely expandable as long as you wanted to do it, with a sort of Darwinian program built in, so bits that were read would die out, and bits that were read would survive and grow. That I thought was a rather good idea, but that also was not in the budget and came out at a late stage. So what you ended up with was a sort of fairly bare bones thing, which does what it does, which is, it sounds sort of foolish thing to say, but I mean, it was all I wanted to do was to write my story. Writing it in this particular way created different methods of writing. I mean, the sections grew shorter and shorter, which is why it became much sort of more cliffhangerish, which is why it adapted it started developing into different genres for each strand, because they were more separate and it was possible to do that, which would have been much more difficult to do had they been one after the other. And converting it into book, of course, and then it was had this thing where lines come down and sections which can be approached from different angles had to work. And I found that writing them so that they worked from any angle was very, very easy. Converting that back into a book again was nightmarish. I'd never actually heard of the term points of view before, because, but I certainly did when it was sent off to be edited, because the editors were completely perplexed by the dreadful writer I was, because the point of view kept on changing to this incomprehensible way that nobody knew what it was, who the person was. It actually makes sense on the app, I think. It doesn't make sense in a book. And so, almost by accident, I had to explore these different ways. I found I had been exploring different ways of writing, without actually thinking about it. It came naturally. And that is fundamentally my problem in trying to all these things, is that I haven't actually thought too much about any of it. I just had set myself a problem of how to write a story like this, and came up with the best functional solution that I could manage. And I have discovered that the people talking today have done a much better job of explaining it than I possibly could, and I suggest you listen to them much more.